So here I want to spend some time to discuss some key principles surrounding the graphical illustration of data. So to begin, let's think a little bit about why we might want to visualize data as part of our data analysis pipeline. So first, one of the main reasons why you visualize data as you are working through your code and your analysis is so that you can do quality control. So it's probably easiest to find, for instance, outliers in your data set by seeing those outliers visually. If you see values that are far from, for instance, the median of a distribution of your data set, you might then understand that you need to investigate those data points a little bit more thoroughly. It's also a good way to make sure that the range of values is plausible, and there are many features of the data that you can infer visually more quickly than you might be able to do with other approaches. This also allows you to, in exploratory analyses, qualitatively evaluate trends or the consistency between quantitative measures that you make from your data and the visual distribution of those data. So it's a good way to do sanity checks on your analysis and to start to understand relationships among variables. And then finally, the primary reason why we use data visualizations in scientific communication is because it's often easier to communicate results with images and figures than it is just with text, right? So, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And that's really one of the guiding principles of thinking about data visualization and how to maximize that information transfer for your audience. So we first wanted to talk through a few different types of figures you might want to include or consider as you are dealing with data. Histograms are really great figures that allow you to visualize distributions of your data. So this might, for histogram, you take a data set and you illustrate how many of those measurements are within certain bins of that you specify for instance, in your code when you call the histogram function. As I said earlier, this is a good way to find outliers or to visually check to see if certain data are normally distributed. One thing to keep in mind when creating histograms is that there's not just a single histogram for a given data set, but the nature and shape of that histogram will depend on the number of bins that you define and the range of data that you use, or the range that you use to define your bins as well. The second type of plot that I most commonly use is some sort of scatter or dot plot. And here, with scatter plots, these are most commonly used to understand or visualize the relationship between two variables. So on the left, we have the relationship between measures of mechanical work and changes in some measure of mechanical work, so that we can get a visual understanding of how those values relate or not to one another. And on the right, this is just an example of a sort of a noisy sine wave where we can see variability in the data from one point to another. One challenge with scatter plots is that if you have a large data set or you have even a small data set with overlapping values, it can be difficult to distinguish between measurements. There are some tricks that you can do in terms of adding outlines and shading to the individual points that help make that a little bit more clear. Happy to help anyone who has questions about how to do that. The next common type of figure that you might often see, particularly when you are looking at time series data, are line plots. And so line plots are really estimates of an underlying continuous measurement, right? So imagine you're swinging your leg back and forth and you have a marker on your foot. The position of that marker as a function of time is continuous. However, your camera system is only making measurements, let's say 100 times per second. So there are gaps between your measurements. So when you plot data by default, for instance in MATLAB using the plot function, in general, MATLAB will connect those points as essentially an assumption of the underlying signal that you are recording. So this relies on a process called interpolation, and so it's important to remember that even though you might plot the figure on the left, the actual data that you record are the figure on the right. Okay? So you always want to make sure you have an understanding of how the program or even your own code is filling in gaps between data points. Another type of figure that's really useful and very much related to the histogram is what's known as a box plot, or technically a box and whisker plot. So these are compact ways to visualize how your data are distributed. In this example, and in most box plots, the red line here corresponds to the median of your data set. The edges of your box correspond to the 25th and 75th percentile. And so with this type of illustration, half of your values lie within this box, right? So it gives you a sense of where the sort of mass of your data lie. And then in addition to those points, you also have whiskers, which can illustrate several things. So in general, they extend to the most extreme value in your data set, so they allow you to see the range of your data. But in most box plot algorithms, there's some threshold at which it will assume that that data points are outliers, and they will show up as, you know, stars or asterisks beyond the whiskers of your box and whisker plot. Now, a last type of plot that I'll just highlight here briefly is one that I would say is almost the most common plot that you see in a lot of published manuscripts, but it's also one that can be quite misleading, and that is the what's called an error bar plot. So here on the left would be a typical error bar plot. So it's a combination of two things. One, a bar plot, where generally the height of the bar corresponds to the mean or the average of a set of data points. And then you have these error bars that extend from the top of the bar. Importantly, those can represent many different things, and what they represent can have fairly large implications as to how your reader or someone would interpret the figure. So I think most commonly you see these error bars as representing the standard error of a set of measurements. But one of the I think main problems with these figures is that they provide very little information about the underlying data. So in this example figure taken from the paper highlighted at the bottom here, these are different data sets that produce essentially the exact same bar and error bar plot on the left. So you can see that when you summarize your data with just two measures, again like a mean and a standard error, you can miss a lot of information about what's going on under the hood. And the other thing that can be challenging about error bar plots is that particularly when you use standard errors, the difference in means between your data set, or the differences in the height of the bar, can often be overinterpreted in terms of conveying the size of the effect in your study. In other words, if I compare A and B, in A I might say, oh, group B has a much better performance, assuming larger values are better, a much better performance than the bar in black, right? Because I'm comparing the means here. However, if I look at B, I can see that there's actually really a lot of overlap between the data. And so I may be much less convinced about the superiority of, let's say, the second treatment here, when I look at the actual data points. So if you'd like to make figures like this, it's often now very much accepted and often expected to just show the data. So these figures are dot plots. They're basically scatter plots. If you really want to illustrate some measure of the midpoint, you can easily add a horizontal line to each set of data to show the median as an example. So just be aware of both when you're analyzing your own data and other data that are reported in the literature, at what may be going on underneath the hood of these types of figures. Okay, so this again highlighted here in B is an example of what it would be a more these days acceptable form of data presentation. So there's PLOS Computational Biology, as many of you may know, has a really great series of 10 simple rules articles for all sorts of things that are of use to the scientific community. So next, I'd like to just highlight some of the keys from their paper on 10 simple rules for better figures, because these should really, I think, guide what you do as you create figures in your programming language of choice. So one of the first things that you want to think about, of course, in any kind of scientific communication or any communication, is really making sure you know your audience. So when we think about graphical illustration, we want to really focus on the information that we're conveying in our figures. So we can think about information as anything on our figure that reduces the viewer's uncertainty about the point that we're trying to make. Okay. So of course, the amount of information that we need to reduce uncertainty depends on who's viewing the figure. So in some cases, if we're just showing data to our lab mates, they know about our project, we've talked to them before, maybe they've done our experiment, there may be very little information they need to understand what we're trying to communicate. On the other end of the spectrum, if we're communicating to the general public, they may just be interested in the big picture, right? So some of the minutiae and details that we really value as scientists may be less important, both because they may be difficult for them to understand, but also because they may not want to spend the effort to follow what you're saying. So this is one of the first things to think about when creating a figure. Who am I creating this figure for? So I think this is a nice example from the paper of a figure that you might expect to see in, let's say the New York Times or other, type of newspaper or website that's meant to communicate information to the general public. So this is a really easy figure to interpret. You can make this figure in MATLAB or whatever program you're using. It's really what's called a stacked bar plot, right? So if I look at this example on the right, the light blue shows the number of new cases on average in a given year of men who have lung cancer, and the dark blue illustrates the number of deaths, right? So I can easily compare which cancers have the leading cause of death and which ones, for instance, are most treatable, right? So prostate cancer is an example where there are many new cases. It would be the maybe most prevalent form. However, a small percentage of those, only a small percentage result in death, right? So it seems to be a very treatable cancer, unlike, as an example, pancreatic cancer. The next point is to really think about the medium that you'll be using to show your figure. So if your figure is going to be used in a paper versus a presentation, you may want to have two different types of figures. With papers, and depending on the journal where you publish, they may have costs associated with using color, as an example. And so you may want to consider if you can illustrate the information in grayscale. Now, if your figure is going to be projected on a screen, you want to have some sense of how large the screen will be relative to the room, right? So if I have a laptop and I'm trying to show just my laptop screen to a room of 100 people, the figure needs to take up most of the screen, right? The font needs to be really huge so people can see it. Conversely, if I have a screen that's the size of the room and there are only 15 people and the room is small, then they'll be able to see much more detail on the screen. So this information should really affect the font sizes you use, line thicknesses, number of words, and so on. Lastly, when you think about the amount of information that you put on a figure, or really this even applies to, for instance, PowerPoint slides, think about how much time your audience has to process that information. So, we can put complex figures in papers because people have essentially an indefinite amount of time to process that information. However, we may need to sort of strip that figure down for a presentation because people only have seconds to process it, and we want to make sure we get the main point across. So this is an example again from the paper where the figure on the left has all the data, and it might be something that you include in a manuscript, whereas the figure on the right is a simplified version of the same set of data that illustrates the key points, right? Key point from this figure being that we're looking at a set of trajectories, doesn't really matter what they are, but the figure on the right shows very clearly that there are some trajectories in red that when they start from their start to end, or they always end up in the top right corner, whereas the trajectories in blue will move to the bottom right or top left corner, right? So really easy to see and easy to process. So the next key point is that you want to make sure you're not trusting the defaults when you create your figures. So regardless of the program you're using, there's a good chance that the default settings create really poor figures. So for example, in MATLAB, when you use plot or histogram or whatever function might be of interest, the font size is generally too small, the line thickness is generally too thin for you to sort of just copy and paste that figure into a PowerPoint or publish it directly from MATLAB. And so what you want to gain some comfort doing, and I'll point to some resources in our GitHub to highlight how you can do this in MATLAB, is that you want to really be comfortable explicitly specifying the settings of your figures so that you can improve the quality of those figures. And we're going to do this via code. So here's an example of a figure on the left that you would create in MATLAB if you're plotting a sine and a cosine function. And MATLAB uses some default colors, and it's, you can tell what the two functions are, but it's not a very informative figure. The figure on the right, we can create that completely via code in MATLAB, and now this figure is much more informative and is designed in a way that helps the reader understand the key points. So one of the ways that we can really think about design is to make sure that we use color effectively. So when we think about adding something to our figure, we always want to focus on whether what we add is contributing useful information. So for adding color, does that color represent some dimension that we need to distinguish for our audience to understand? So if we start adding color, most programs have what's called a color map that specifies the set of colors used for the figures by default and the sequence in which those colors are added to the figure. So for instance, one problem with a lot of these color maps is they may use red and green as two early options for colors, but this may cause problems for people who have red-green color blindness. And so when thinking about color, there are a lot of resources about, any resource on design will talk about color. Color Brewer is a website that I like that gives you some examples of color maps that you may want to use. And you should think about the different purposes for different types of color maps. So these might be sequential colors, where the variation intuitively could represent low to high values. A diverging color map, where maybe there's a central color, like let's say white, and then the colors diverge from there. Well, you may not use white, you may use something yellow or something like that stands out from the background. And then lastly, maybe you're just representing differences in groups, right? You have a qualitative variable that you want to distinguish, and you don't want to use colors that convey, scale or sort of low to high. You just want to distinguish different groups. So here's an example of a few different color maps that illustrate these points, where you can use both qualitative or diverging or sequential colors for the same data. Now, this is one of my, I think, favorite points about thinking when you think about design in general is avoiding anything that's unnecessary. So this is commonly referred to as chart junk in the world of data visualization. So this is anything on your figure that does not improve the message, right? So you can always remove information that doesn't help convey information about your data. So here's an example where these are two of the same data sets. The one on the left has lots of unnecessary features. You can argue whether or not the grid is necessary, but the background color is definitely not necessary. And the default settings create some really odd numbers that aren't really useful. The figure on the right takes that same data and helps better illustrate how each of those series or each of those signals stands out from the others. So this type of figure, again, is something that you can make really easily once you gain control over data visualization in your programming language of choice. Now, when we create figures for publication, we want to really think about information that we include in the caption that helps the reader understand the figure. So I remember as a grad student, I used to get really frustrated when I would read papers and I'd see these really long captions and it didn't really make sense to me. But over time, I really started to appreciate, let me show this example here, the fact that if you just take the figure and the caption is detailed and explains everything about the figure, you can essentially read through the paper just by looking at the figures, right? So if you have a methods figure, an example of raw data, and then the data that sort of the processed data, that can be a really useful way, if done well, to help people understand the key points from your work as quickly as possible. So just some things that you want to keep in mind with captions are explaining the data that you're showing, what axes represent, any abbreviations, and you might want to highlight special cases, right? Outliers as an example. And maybe it's important to clearly specify what those mean. So think really carefully and put some time into creating your captions. Speaking of time, when you make figures, it really often takes quite a while to make good figures. And so this is something that you want to do if you have a deadline coming up. You want to make your figures early so that you have time to refine your message. And this is often just going to rely on trial and error. So making figures, looking at it yourself to see if it communicates the point effectively, asking lab mate or colleague if they understand it. And if not, you may need to think about the design and revise that, or reprocess the data in some way to make the information easier to understand. So I really like, again, this is another principle of design. If you're not naturally really creative, the best thing to do is to find good examples. So this is just a list of some options for finding good examples, but one of my favorite things to do is just to look at recent publications in journals that generally have high impact factors. They often have really nice figures, either because the authors created them themselves or there was someone from the outside, an actual scientific illustration professional who created the figures. So find good inspiration and really think about how you can step up your figure design. So now we want to take some time to think about how we can improve the quality of figures, particularly in MATLAB. And we're going to do that by relying on an 8-step process. So in this case, we want to determine our message, figure out what we're trying to communicate, and then sketch a blueprint of that figure. Now, this is something you can do before you collect any data, and I think this is often really important to do at the design stage of an experiment. So you want to think about, what are the measurements I'm making? What am I going to be comparing? What's my hypothesis? What do I imagine the data will look like? And then that also ties into the statistical model that you'll use to test your hypotheses. Once we have a sense of the figure we want to create, we need to then select a plotting function that's appropriate for that figure. In selecting that function, there are generally several properties that we can manipulate. So you want to take some time, look at help documentation to make sure you know which properties you might want to modify. Then as we start to think about the data we're going to add and the information we're communicating, often we may want to represent more than one variable. Right? And so we need to think about how we're going to differentiate those variables. What's on the x versus y axis? What do different colors represent, or different line types, and so on. So you don't want to just do this arbitrarily. You want to just think about how the decisions you make impact someone's ability to understand your message. So once you've done all the planning, then of course you create and annotate your plot. This comes along step 6 and 7 you really want to do at the same time, but you want to think about specifying the size of the plot, so its dimensions, colors, and all the other properties that really help tune it to your message. And then finally, we need to export and save that figure. So when thinking about your message, that simply means what is it that you're hoping to communicate to your audience? Are you trying to show distributions, summary statistics, association? All of those things, as we've already said previously, are best communicated with different types of figures. A key thing about a figure is that really the figure does best when conveying information that's hard to process in text. Okay? So for instance, if I'm just reporting the range of ages of my participants, I don't need to show that as a figure, right? I can just show the mean and standard deviation, or the mean, the median, and the range. That's generally quite simple, and I'm also not using that information generally as in my statistical analysis. Okay? So just think about if you actually need a figure to convey that message. I mentioned earlier that you would like to ideally sketch a blueprint before you start creating your figures. And this can really help you work through different options. So as an example, here are 4 different ways that you could think about sketching some data. Maybe I have data from 3 groups. I can think about just showing a histogram that has the values for everyone. Maybe that's not ideal. I could try an error bar plot. We've talked about some of the limitations with that. I may think then, well, maybe I'll just use a box and whisker plot. It's a little bit more transparent, shows information about the distribution of my data. But then maybe I settle on the most transparent illustration, which is a dot plot here at the bottom. Okay? So this is something you can do really quickly, again, without even having any data. One additional advantage of sketching these types of blueprints is that you can start adding numbers to your axes, right? What kinds of values do you expect? What kinds of differences do you expect? And it really helps you to think through your experiment or your study. So then once you know what kind of plot you'd like to make, you then need to evaluate different functions. In general, if you can think about a form of data visualization, you can probably create it in MATLAB. At least for me, I haven't found any reason to use another piece of software for making figures. So this is just a list of common functions you might want to use to make your figures. There are many, many more, but these are, I think, what are most commonly used in analysis of human movement. Now, there are also many user-generated functions that you can find on MATLAB's website through the file exchange. So if you can't find the type of function you need within MATLAB, you might be able to rely on something that someone else has written. However, of course, you always want to make sure when you do that you do quality control and make sure that code is doing what you expect. Lastly, maybe you could write your own custom scripts from scratch, and in the spirit of open science, share those with the community through something like the file exchange or GitHub. So once you've chosen a function, you should recognize that almost all functions have many different properties that you can customize, and we already mentioned using the help browser to make sure you understand what's that function is capable of doing. So this is just an example of different ways that the box plot function can illustrate your data. Right? So just same function, specify one property, and that can differentiate between the figure on the top and the one on the bottom. So as we've mentioned before, we want to think carefully about how we differentiate variables of interest. You want to make this really easy for your audience to do. So one thing to keep in mind with respect to figure design is that we view figures in 2D. We haven't quite moved to the place where we all have VR headsets or AR projections and can see data in 3D very easily. So you really want to think about laying out a figure in 2D, and then instead of representing sort of a third dimension into the screen, using other properties for that dimension. One thing that's, I think, underutilized is the fact that you can use color to highlight portions of your figure to just draw the reader's interest or attention. Okay, so that can help you make your point more quickly. One key thing to be aware of here is that at some point, the amount of information you convey, the added value of trying to convey more information starts to sort of trail off, right? So there are diminishing returns. So you always want to make sure that you're adding useful information for the reader. So here's an example of a figure from a colleague's paper where they're showing the time course of different sort of signals in a model. And you can see here that the different colors correspond to different time constants on the right. And there's an intuitive mapping between cold and hot, right? As the signal becomes warmer, its qualitative shape begins to change. So it's really easy to see that here. And then there's shading in the background that corresponds to different aspects of the experiment in this case. Right? So quite a bit of information conveyed in a compact form. So once you have thought about how you're going to specify different properties, you then create your figure and add annotations. So annotations, of course, are necessary to make sure that you reduce confusion by the reader or your audience. Things you should immediately do whenever you create a figure are add axis labels, ideally using full words without abbreviations, and including units when relevant. You can also add text to your figures, and arrows and boxes, again, to highlight specific portions of your data. Okay, so be creative, exert full control over your illustrations. So these are just some functions that would be relevant in MATLAB to add annotations to your figure. So we've talked about taking control again by setting properties. So one thing that I like to do when performing analysis and really thinking about creating figures that will ultimately be published in a journal is making sure that I specify figure size. Okay? So this is something that I didn't really understand as a student, but there are often cases where you might, figure might look good on your laptop, but when you submit it to the journal, it's resized in some form or smaller and becomes really difficult to read. So one way around that is by specifying the size of the figure up front and making sure you can read it when it's at that size. So as an example, the Journal of Neurophysiology has guidelines for figures of different size, and you can specify these properties directly in MATLAB. Once your figure is of the correct size, then it becomes really easy to specify the font sizes, the tick marks, and so on, so that it's legible. And in general, if your figure is legible at the size that it would be printed in a journal, it will always be legible as you scale it up for a presentation or a poster. Finally, we want to export and save our figures. I typically export at least 2 versions of a figure, one PDF and one TIFF file. So PDFs are nice because occasionally you may need to annotate the figure in some other program, Illustrator, or any number of other programs. Generally, I try not to do that. I'm a big fan of doing everything in MATLAB. TIFF files can be great in case you want to embed high-resolution figures in documents or presentations. I also save a version of the figure in MATLAB's native format, or their proprietary format, with some kind of informative name, so that it's easy to go back to if I need to modify it in some way and export it again. So with that, here are a handful of references. I'll add these to our GitHub as well, in case you would like to do a little bit more exploration in the world of data visualization.